Hello, my name is Viv Ellis and I'm of the Faculty of Education here at Monash University in a very windy Melbourne. I begin by saying that I'm speaking on the unceded land of the Kulin Nation, the land on which Monash now stands. And I pay my respects to the elders of the Kulin Nations, past, present and future, and also acknowledge and pay my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are participating today. Welcome to our public panel discussion on 150 years of public education in Australia, progress made and remaining challenges for students with disability. Welcome to those of you in person and also to all of you live streaming in from wherever you are in the state, around the country or indeed the world. If you're live streaming in, we encourage you to take part in the discussion and ask questions in the YouTube chat. And you do need to be logged into YouTube to do that. And if you use social media, please use the hashtags Research in Action and Universal Education, tagging @Monash Education in your tweets. I'm really sorry that I can't be present in person as I'm currently in the Arctic Circle of Norway catching up with a research project that has been seriously delayed by COVID. 2022 marks two significant anniversaries in the history of education in Australia. First, it is 150 years since the first public school system was created through Victoria's Free, Fair and Secular Education Act of 1872. Second, it's 30 years since the rights to education for students with disability were protected by Australia's Disability Discrimination Act of 1992. And as the full title of today's discussion suggests, while there has been progress, there remain challenges and questions in realising the ideals of a fully inclusive education system, particularly for students with disability. As a newcomer to Australia, the history of the 1872 Act in Victoria, the first such act of lands that were later to become a federated Australia, is fascinating to me because the debates at the time were channeled through very different discourses to the 1862 Act in Britain that established universal primary education. The achievements of Justice George Higginbotham in Victoria arose out of a commitment to tackling social divisions and poverty that had been fueled by sectarianism. By shifting and establishing responsibility for education with the state, Higginbotham also made the state responsible for a kind of education that would build greater social cohesion through an equitable system. And therein lies the challenge that faces all education systems today: how to create an equitable system that is also truly inclusive. Equity meaning that individuals have a right to have their needs, wants and aspirations met, and inclusive meaning that everyone has that right, but also that collectively the system assumes responsibility at a societal level. This public event addresses the significant challenges and questions that are implicit in both the legacy of the 1872 Act and the protections afforded by the 1992 Act. Our panel will tackle the issues from a variety of perspectives, including some from lived personal experience. The overarching questions are: how can we create a fairer society through universal access to inclusive education? What does such an inclusive system look like? And crucially, how do we get there? I'll now hand over to our MC for the event, Graham Innes, AM.
Streaming in, as the Dean said. I think these hybrid events are going to be the way we work from now on. So it's something that we need to get used to. My name's Graham Innes. I am the former Disability Discrimination Commissioner for Australia and a passionate advocate about inclusive education, having experienced both forms of segregated and inclusive education, and so I can bring that lived experience to my passion. I'd like to join the Dean in acknowledging the lands on which we live, work and learn, and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded to those lands. I especially acknowledge that the Wurundjeri and Bon Wurrung people, communities of the Kulin Nation, are the ongoing custodians of the lands on which Monash University now stands. I pay my respects, as does Monash through its research, teaching and learning, to the Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung elders and past, present and future communities. And as we move together along the path to reconciliation through our discussion of a First Nations voice to Parliament, I'm pleased to acknowledge the people who first started this country so many thousands of years ago. So as I said, welcome in person to the audience. It's great to have you here in the room, but it's also fantastic to have the many of you both live streaming tonight and watching the recording of this lecture later on. I've seen the numbers, and I'm sure those of us not from Monash join Monash in being very pleased with the response that the event has received. Live captioning is available. There's a slide on the screen now with the details and the QR code. I encourage live streamers to discuss and input to the questions in the YouTube comments chat, and you will need to be logged into YouTube to be able to do this, and instructions were sent in your reminder emails, and they are in the YouTube chat as well. That'll be the first item in the chat. I encourage everyone to get involved with Slido, which we're using for polling today, and you can follow the QR code or link on your device to participate. And those of us in the room can also participate on Slido. And in fact, I think the first of our Slido polls will be details about where you come from. So it'll be fascinating to see how that comes up and where people are live streaming in. There'll also be other polls for Q&A to vote on what questions you would like the presenter or panel to answer. You know, you've been at a function and someone starts asking a question and it's not on a topic you're very interested in, or it goes on for way too long. Well, you can vote that down now. So how much power have you got? That's great. And use Slido to do that. How and why things happen is really important. If we don't know from where and by whom tests, assessments, and in fact any other processes are developed, then we can't really rely on their efficacy. And this is particularly true in relation to people with disabilities, because such historic processes can be driven by historic attitudes. And we know even now what the attitudes, the negative and limiting attitudes are towards people with disabilities in our society. Don't start me on that topic. It's the one I could talk about for a long time. But we also know that in the past, those attitudes were even more limiting and more negative. How we learn can also be defined by historic attitudes. And it's important to understand how we came to the conclusion that the best way to prepare children with disabilities for their life in general society was to segregate us in schools. It teaches us nothing about living in society, and it teaches society about nothing with sharing the environment and living with us. But we do it anyway. It's a lose-lose, but we do it anyway. So why do we do it, and what can we do about it? Those are the questions for discussion tonight, as the Dean told us. Having set that scene in conjunction with the Dean, let me introduce our first keynote presenter. Dr. Kate de Bruin is a senior lecturer in inclusion and disability in the Faculty of Education at Monash University. She's taught in secondary school and in higher education for 2 decades. She has played a central role in developing the inclusive education courses in both the Masters of Teaching and the Masters of Education programs at Monash University. Kate's research focuses on inclusive education in policy and in practice, examining system, school and classroom practices that are supported by evidence and that promote equality and equity and quality for all students, with specific attention to students with disability. Kate regularly provides professional learning to school teachers, and she writes for both academics as well as readers from the general public, such as myself. Please welcome Dr. Kate de Bruin.
That's okay. Thank you so much, Graham. So welcome everybody. It's an absolute delight to have you all here tonight to mark the anniversary of these 2 legislative birthdays. The first legislation for Victorian education, which underpinned the later Education Acts all around the country. So the Education Act of 1872 here in Victoria, which turns 150 this year, as well as the Disability Discrimination Act of 1992, or the DDA, which turns 30. Both acts were developed amidst fairly extensive public debate, but they ultimately passed through Parliament because there was strong support for their vision of addressing social inequity and eliminating discrimination. And that's the focus of the event here tonight. How much progress have we made in achieving that vision, and what's the work left to be done? I offer a content warning. I will be discussing parts of history that use offensive language to describe people with disability, and I'll be using some quotes from these. It's such an honour to have you with us here, Graham. I couldn't be more chuffed. Graham played such a significant role in the drafting of the DDA and administered the legislation in his role as Hearing Commissioner at the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission, as well as his subsequent role as the Disability Discrimination Commissioner. He's such a staunch and fearless advocate for the inclusive education of students with disability, so it's really fitting that you're here with us to celebrate this birthday and consider the work achieved and remaining. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of George Higginbotham, Chief Architect of the Education Act here in Victoria. Higginbotham was a fierce and uncompromising advocate for a public education system that would address social divisions, particularly the divide between rich and poor. He was such a vocal critic of the harm that he saw in society, particularly as the Church of England, resourced by the Crown in the UK, tried to establish a monopoly that was fiercely resisted by other church organisations here, and they tried to compete to establish their communities, including competing in establishing schools. They had such great disparity in access to resources, capacity to pay teachers, build buildings, and this affected the quality of the education that they provided, resulting in really disparate access to an education depending on where children lived and what churches they attend. Lots of people argue that convincing the churches to give up their children to the state to take over their education was Higginbotham's greatest legacy. I argue that it's in fact his vision for an education that would be universal and a system in which all children would belong that is his true legacy. Higginbotham saw that this was the road to address some of the particular delinquency and criminality that was particularly rife in the poorer communities. And as citizens at the time were being given the vote, he saw that it had the possibility to create a cohesive society of responsible adult voters who would live in harmony with each other. Just take a moment, if you can, to look at the pictures of poverty and wealth I have on the screen. Higginbotham was so concerned about the children living in these conditions that he argued that education alone could address the rising crime and delinquency rates, and he convinced his wealthy peers, including those he was in Parliament with, that educating the poor and the working class was the way to create a better society. And the significance of this cannot be underestimated. As my Dean Vivella said before, the arguments were very different elsewhere in the world. But here in Victoria, there was a lot of liberalism that was rife in the government. So even though he was on a conservative political party, he was a radical. The debates held at the time demonstrate his commitment to a socially just community. It took him many attempts, a royal commission, and 2 attempts to get the legislation through Parliament before he succeeded. But I think as Victorians and Australians, we should be very proud. However, although attendance at the new schools being developed was compulsory, in reality, it really only provided an education for some students and not for all. This is because there were exemptions built in at the time. So those who were receiving an education elsewhere, such as at private schools, those who resided more than 2 miles from a school, which was an exemption to cater to the students who were living in possibly regional areas as the government acquired land and built schools, but also those who were prevented by sickness, fear of infection, temporary or permanent infirmity, which I think we can all agree equates to disability. After the Act was introduced, there was pressure on the government to provide an access to an education for those exempted students. And so the government amended the legislation several times over a 20-year period between 1890 and 1910, adding references to special schools. They also developed and expanded specific settings for what were termed at the time feeble-minded children, deaf and dumb and blind. In the revisions to the legislation, a mandate was placed on parents of children with disability, making them responsible for the education of their children, and if they were unable to provide this, to have their children live in an institution where the education would be provided for free, but they would pay for their maintenance. History records that life in these institutions was hard. It was isolating, and that those living there were often exploited, mistreated, and died young. However, they were few in number, and the relatively low numbers of children residing within them, about a quarter of the residents, means that the legislators at the time who wrote these exemptions could not have imagined that their exemptions would in fact lead to the creation of a stratified system, large and expansive, for segregating students, and yet this is precisely what happened. It's a particular quirk of history that explains this. At the time, Galton had just published his work on social Darwinism and eugenics. Eugenics was a theory that the human race could be perfected by eliminating unwanted traits. Through selective breeding, isolation and control of people seen to be less than perfect, eugenics was very popular at the time and created considerable social anxiety. It was not until the 20th century that it was discredited as unscientific, racially biased, particularly after the adoption of its doctrines by the Nazis, who used it to justify the killing and imprisonment of Jews, disabled people and other minority groups. But at the same time that public education was being developed here in Victoria, Galton was arguing that biology and genetics explained criminality and unwanted behaviour. They recommended the control of people they saw and described as deviant. Now, the Australian Medical Association and their state-based counterpart here in Victoria enthusiastically adopted these doctrines and promoted them, arguing that the mentally deficient were hereditarily prone to crime, poverty and moral depravity, and that the wider community needed to be protected from them. This affected education in 2 really critical ways. The first was that it led to wide-scale testing, and the second was that it led to the tools by which this testing was done. This was all done by co-opting and repurposing the new intelligence quotient, or IQ assessment, developed by Alfred Binet. Now, Binet developed the IQ test because he wanted to find out how to bring support to students in schools when those students were struggling. However, in the hands of eugenicists, such as Goddard and Dole, working out of centres like the Vineland Training School for Feeble-Minded Boys and Girls, these tests were changed beyond their original purpose. Tests to screen for deviance were developed, adapted, and new ones invented to classify people as being within the normal or subnormal range of intelligence and to assign a mental age or degree of defectiveness accordingly. It's interesting that versions of the tests they created remain widely used in assessing children today, although time has obscured their origins and provided them with a cloak of respectability. Notable examples include the BERT word reading test, the Vineland Adaptive Behaviour Scale, and the Porteous-Maze test. Now, at the time when these assessments were developed and enthusiastically implemented to screen the huge numbers of children for deficiency, more testing led to more children being identified, and accordingly, the Department of Education responded by developing a suite of increasingly segregated options for students to be placed. Children labelled as dull, with IQ scores of the 71 to 85 range, accessed opportunity grades, which were segregated classes within regular schools, while those who were labelled as feeble-minded, with IQ scores of 50 to 70, were segregated into separate special schools altogether. Melbourne's first public segregated school, the Bell Street Special School, opened accordingly in 1913, and young people with low IQ scores or mental ages were placed there. The role of the principal, Stanley Porteous, was to both screen the children and also train others in using the assessments. Now, with so much testing going on, the numbers of children identified as being defective rose exponentially, resulting in the creation of even more institutions. Two notable examples include the Travancore Developmental Centre and the Jane Field Colony for the Treatment of Mental Defectives. Now, within these settings, it was medical treatment provided and not education. They were often, at that time, inhospitable and violent places. And their existence and the huge industry of testing and assessment that filled their wards ran completely counter to Higginbotham's vision for Victoria's education system as reducing delinquency and creating belonging. So while Higginbotham had convinced society and Parliament that it was education that would reduce criminality and delinquency, eugenicists argued that these traits were biologically determined and sought to limit educational access and opportunity for disabled children and remove them from society. So let's fast forward to the end of World War II, and I will provide people with access to a copy of my slides, so you do not need to read what is on there. It's there for visual purposes only. Following the end of World War II, a global vision for a peaceful society was drawn up in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The document was strongly informed by the violence perpetrated against the many children and adults, including those with disability, on whom the tools of genocide had been tested, trialled and refined. Together, the human rights specified in the Declaration were seen as a roadmap to making this cohesive society. It was argued that if we all are valued members of society and belong together, those atrocities can never happen again. And following the Universal Declaration, which is an aspirational and non-binding document, a series of treaties were created by the UN and accordingly signed and ratified by countries who therefore agreed to turn the obligations into law in their countries, which includes Australia. So this timeline here is a selection of some of the UN treaties following the declaration that specify rights for disabled people and for education. Now, some of the earlier versions of these documents affirmed that education was a right, but they also permitted this right to be limited for young people with disability on the basis of what was considered the severity of that disability. So some people were considered too disabled to be able to enjoy those rights. However, what it did argue was that all children should be accessing something, and this led to real progress. There were large numbers of young people with disability who'd been previously seen as ineducable, and they now began to access some of these institutions who in turn were informed by those human rights. These places were mostly a far cry from the institutions of the late 19th century. However, they frequently offered medical care rather than anything that we would all recognise here as education. There still remained about 15% of young people with disability who remained deemed ineducable and sat outside any of this kind of training at all. So between the 1970s and the present day, UN treaties have increasingly specified the preference for students with disability to access their education in their local regular school, but this wasn't explicitly stated as a right without limitation until the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, or the CRPD. So if we think of, and I note that the change in UN language was down to the incredible self-advocacy by disabled people's organisations. Now, those earlier treaties led to a number of national and state-based initiatives here in Australia, including the rise of the integration movement. The aim of this movement was to have students with disability going to their local school. However, the schools expressed some anxiety that this was work they hadn't done before, and they requested that they be resourced accordingly. So the Department of Education in each state and territory set up funding models, and they allocated funding according to specific disability categories and a sliding scale of impairment to determine how much money schools needed to provide the support required. It was here that those historical tools of diagnosis and assessment took on new life, particularly those relating to intellectual and developmental disability. These models, these funding models, and their reliance on those tests meant that students had to get a diagnosis from this pre-approved category and be, if you like, disabled enough before their school could get funding. This led to some equity problems. So some students had a diagnosis that sat outside those pre-approved categories. Some students just missed out on funding. And what this meant was there was some confusion by schools regarding the eligibility of those children for support. But perhaps the biggest issue was that the diagnosis and assessment scores were retained as enrolment criteria for segregated settings, which meant that mainstream schools could, and often did, suggest that these students belonged elsewhere. Now, it wasn't until 1992, when the federal government introduced the Disability Discrimination Act, that this was made unlawful. It was considered discrimination to deny student enrolment or access to learning or participation at school. And the DDA also contained a vastly more expansive definition of disability, which was a really progressive move. This had the potential to make schools more aware of who was entitled to support. However, the states retained their funding models based on the categories. And what we know is that about 15% of students with disability were accessing funding through those models, which meant that those were the number of students counted. The students who remained unfunded had to often fight to access support and reasonable adjustments. They often lost that fight, and many who did receive funding were told they would be better off elsewhere. This meant that regular schools, despite their explicit obligations under the DDA, were able to conform with state-based policy and disregard their legal obligation to accept all comers. So unfortunately, the DDA didn't lead to change. Now, the DDA was never designed to provide explicit guidance to schools, but because of the mismatch between the definition of disability and the funding models, this meant that the federal government was handing money to the states, who were handing it out in a manner misaligned with that federal legislation. Students continued to go without funding even after the introduction of the Disability Standards for Education, which were meant to be standards for compliance, and the gaps in services for students with disability continued. Indeed, my research showed that following the DDA and following the DSE, the segregation of students actually increased. So it wasn't until 2009, when Australia ratified the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, that Australia embraced the obligation that to uphold the rights of people with disability regardless of their impairment. Nobody under the CRPD is too disabled to enjoy their rights. These rights are without exception and without limitation. The treaty places binding obligations on any country like Australia who's signed and ratified, including the obligation to provide an inclusive education. In 2016, the UN put out a guidance document explaining what that meant and what it didn't mean. And you can see up here the definitions of the terms that they included. The definition of inclusive education, which is down the bottom, argued that this was to be educated alongside non-disabled peers within the regular school system with access to appropriate and support based on consultation. They argued that the segregation of the organisation of students with disability into environments based on that disability constituted segregation, and they offered guidance for how schools could be reformed to achieve genuine inclusion and get rid of the old, special and mainstream to create a new and transformed system for everybody. Now, I wish I could tell you that that had happened, but as yet it has not. However, there is good progress that's occurred in Australia, and I believe it looks very promising. Specifically, the greatest progress is that the states are moving away from their old funding model based in disability categories. These are being replaced by funding models based on student need. This is, in my view, the biggest game changer. Several of the states have revised their policies and funding models accordingly already. South Australia and Tasmania have already done theirs, and Victoria is in the process of rolling theirs out. Although I note that the model being rolled out in Victoria retains diagnostic eligibility criteria, particularly relying on the Vineland assessment. Now, the new funding models are still too new for us to understand a clear picture of their success in closing those equity gaps about the students who didn't receive funding and therefore often went without support. And it's too new for us to understand whether it changes patterns of enrolment, but there is much to be hoped from this. So it's time we come together as a community to work to achieve this original intent, for our education system to be one for every child. The system we live with was clearly not designed with every child in mind from the start, although that was the vision and the intent for the legislation. So we need to revive that vision and get rid of mainstream and get rid of special. We need a single system designed with every student in mind, and we can't do this while the tools of disability assessments continue to play the role that they do. The history behind those assessments of disability, as I've shown you tonight, were developed to classify and separate people, and they clearly remain operational in that role today. While once used to separate people with disability for the good of society, they're now used to separate people often under the argument of care and support. Yet the outcomes of our separated system are indefensible. This can't continue. The current system relies on intellectual and developmental assessments that appear entrenched in our system, and these serve to feed and perpetuate segregation. And I argue we can't address that until we uncouple our reliance on those assessments. It's time we do so. We can all play our part in this. We can challenge the priority given to those assessments in the roles that we take. Parents, if an IQ test is requested for your child, question this. It may be relevant, needed and appropriate, it may not. So ask, what information will be used from this assessment? Will it inform my child's education planning? Might it be used to decline my child's enrolment at a school or to discourage it? Policymakers, question the role given to IQ and Vineland assessments in your policymakers. What better assessments of students' functional need might we be able to use that would genuinely inform their educational planning? We need to advocate to replace these old, outdated assessments that offer usually very little by way of educational value. So it's time, as I said, to do away with mainstream and special and bring supports to where students are, not ask them to go somewhere else to access them. Sustained evidence from 5 decades of research shows that when we deliver these educational supports in an inclusive model in a regular school, the outcomes are better for all students, disabled and non-disabled students. Inclusion is a tide that lifts all the boats. Only by educating our children within inclusive settings can we realise this dream of a society where everyone is valued and belongs. And I leave you with this image of my own children with their friend, Griffin, in the middle. My kids have been lucky enough to access an inclusive education and their lives have been immeasurably enriched as a result. And I argue no child deserves anything less. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that presentation. You know, it's really important for us to go back and look at what we've done and how we've got to where we are in order for us to redress some of the discrimination that still exists. And I thank you for putting together that assessment. You gave us a content warning about some of the language that would be used. And I can't speak for any other person with a disability in the room, but I hear that language and it hurts. But I encourage all of you, because it's important that Kate use that language to demonstrate the story that she was telling. I encourage all of you to turn that hurt into renewing your passion for changing the ableism that exists not only in our language, but throughout our society. I now want to introduce our second keynote presenter, Professor Suzanne Carrington. Professor Carrington is a professor in the Centre for Inclusive Education and a member of the Faculty of Creative Industries, Education and Social Justice. They won the award for the longest title there, I think, Suzanne. Suzanne's areas of expertise are in inclusive education, in ethical leadership for disability and teacher preparation for inclusive schools. She has engaged in research to inform policy and practice in Australian and international education contexts, and she has published over 90 journal publications, books, book chapters and research reports. Please welcome Suzanne Carrington.
Thank you so much, Graham. And I really would also just like to particularly thank Kate for inviting me to come here today. It's so great to see you all, and also to thank Chantel, who's running around behind the scenes, who's been our big organiser. So today I'm speaking about societal, systemic, school and family drivers for and barriers to desegregation. But before I start on my talk, I want you to know that before I worked in the university setting, I have been a teacher, and I'm a special education trained teacher and have spent many years teaching in special schools in Queensland and in England, including time teaching in Townsville at a special school that was attached to an institution. So thank you, Kate, for that really great history lesson. But I was teaching in a school in the mid-1980s where most of the children that I taught were wards of the state. Their parents had been advised by the medical doctors to give up their child and to put them in an institution. And I taught children, from babies in early intervention right through to young adults. And I've spoken about that in a TED Talk if you're interested to hear a bit more about that. So even though you might think some of those photos and those stories were sad, we were still actually in that situation in the 1980s. I also had the great opportunity to teach in Cairns, which many people don't know, closed their special school through parent advocacy. So I was a teacher there in 1990. And I always say I learnt the most about inclusive education from the parents that I worked with at that time. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a program of research that myself and my colleagues have been doing in the Centre for Inclusive Education. And this is a roadmap that gives you a bit of an idea of some of the papers that we've been writing. The focus is really on the future of special schools research program, and particularly around desegregation. So we started in 2020 when we got a strategic grant from the Centre for Inclusive Education, and I'm just going to give you a short summary of the first paper, which is the future of special schools in Australia, and thinking about whether we're compliant with the CRPD. The second paper is about closing special schools and drawing lessons from Canada, which many of you will know is very well respected for its work in developing and really transforming their education system to having one inclusive education system. There's a third paper which is really drawing on the evidence from Italy, which is not published yet. And then I'm going to be particularly focusing on this paper that I mentioned today, which is talking about desegregation in particular. And we presented some of this work at a forum, a Centre for Inclusive Education forum, and I'm really excited to be able to present the work to you today. So just a really sort of short background here, because Kate has really given us a fantastic background. I just wanted to really sort of focus in on the CRPD once again, and to, I guess, remind us that students with a disability have a right to an inclusive education as part of us in Australia being a signatory to the CRPD, and we're really well informed now with general comment number 4. We also have the Disability Standards for Education, the DSE as many of us call them, which clearly state that students with disability are entitled to enrol in their local school and access education on the same basis as their peers without disability. And that's really what inclusive education is all about. We also have a new disability strategy, which clearly also says in Policy Priority 2 that we need to be focused on building capability in the delivery of inclusive education to improve educational outcomes for school students with disability. So we have a lot of national commitment here for inclusive education, but we know, and Kate has really showed us in her talk and in the paper that she's written, that segregated education in Australia is increasing, which has led us to do the program of work that we are doing. So even though we have committed to progress inclusive education through our signing of the CRPD, we still actually have a dual system of education in Australia. And we know that also right around the world, we have there's often evidence of a dual system, a special and a mainstream system is common in many other places around the world as well. And it's really challenging to sort of move away from that. So it's interesting I do a lot of work in international countries, and some of the more developing countries, the work that I do in progressing inclusive education in some ways is much easier because they haven't established a special education system. They don't have to unravel that. We're just sort of moving forward with an inclusive approach. So this idea of the dual system is important, but we also need to think about this term segregation. We know from a general comment 4 that it's clearly defined, and that's a term that's used to describe special schooling for students with disability. And the term desegregation has been used to describe the process of closing special, meaning segregated schools, and progressing inclusive education. So the first paper was called The Future of Special Schools, led by Carly Lasage in our team. And this first paper examined recent state, territory and federal reviews and inquiries into the education of students with disability in Australian schools, looking at 2 key questions. The first was around whether there is any commitment to closing special schools, and the second question was around whether there is any recommendation to change resourcing models. So in response to question 1, about whether any inquiries or reviews, and these we looked at inquiries and reviews that had been done, published post General Comment 4, so after 2016. So in response to question 1 about whether any inquiries or reviews committed to the closure of special schools, we found that although there is support for inclusive education in principle as an evidence-based practice and one that reflects a cultural shift within society, no inquiries or reviews promoted a commitment to inclusive education by recommending the closure of segregated settings. Instead, these reviews focused on all the recommendations that were required to first ensure the system is inclusive. There was a general sense in many reviews inquiries that a key first step is to have a shared vision and policy for inclusive education. However, there were also caveats around implementation of these proposed policies. No firm timeframes, and sometimes a lack of clear understanding of inclusive education when supporting and maintaining segregated settings alongside inclusive education, with no acknowledgement that a dual system is incompatible with general comment number 4. All the reviews and inquiries that we looked at highlighted the challenges faced by education systems in providing inclusive education, and encouragingly the need to improve inclusive education practices and educators' knowledge. However, this need for improvement was a recurring theme used to justify the need for maintaining segregated options. Unsurprisingly, maintaining a segregated system was commonly related to the right or choice of parents and carers to choose special schools for their children. However, General Comment 4 clearly states that inclusive education is the right of the learner and that parent responsibilities are subordinate to the rights of their child. Rather than committing to closing special schools, a number of reports recommended alternative models for how special schools can be used to support mainstream schools to educate students with disability. For example, centres of excellence, resource hubs, co-location of special schools and mainstream schools to allow resource sharing. What was not discussed was how many of these models have already been trialled repeatedly over the years. In relation to question 2 about whether there were recommendations to changing resourcing models, including transferring allocations from segregated to inclusive settings, again, no inquiries or reviews recommended this. Instead, 3 key issues were raised around resourcing. There was widespread belief there was insufficient funding and more was required to educate students with disability. However, less agreement across jurisdictions about how additional resourcing should be used. Example, New South Wales said increased funding should go to segregated settings. Queensland and Victoria proposed using it to establish expertise within the system. For example, someone leading the inclusive education agenda in the system. And there was also some reference to the financial efficiency of co-locating all students with disability together. The challenges in how different jurisdictions allocated funding to students with disability was also raised. Example, the lack of accountability about how funding a school received for a child was actually used. The difficulties of obtaining diagnoses, particularly due to financial or geographical barriers, and how students who were unfunded or unverified disabilities are more likely to experience gatekeeping. The move to needs-based funding, for example, the recently announced reasonable adjustment resourcing model in Queensland, may help to alleviate some of these challenges, and Kate also alluded to those new resourcing models. The strongest theme around resourcing was the need to increase professional learning and workforce capability around students with disability, with a long laundry list of suggested topics, many of which are already offered. Reading between the lines, the reviews were essentially saying that first we need to spend money on upskilling before we can consider fully realising inclusive education. So our second paper reports on a collaborative critical review of the Canadian literature, and I mentioned before about why we chose Canada. And what we were keen to do was to develop a conceptual framework of drivers for and barriers to special school closure. So you can see here we've got societal, systems, school, community, which in the end we actually changed to family because we felt what we were really talking about here was parent advocacy and what happened in terms of the family. So we used that framework as an analytic tool to gather evidence of drivers and barriers to desegregation in Queensland in Australia, and we conducted reflexive thematic analysis of data available in the Queensland government websites, policy and strategy documents, media announcements, teacher and principals associations, advocacy and parenting groups websites, special school websites, and public social media sites. So that's just a list of all of those sites if people want to find out about that in a bit more detail. So the results are reported using the framework domains of societal, systemic, school and family. And in our paper that is actually in press, data files were numbered to identify the source of data and to protect identification. So this is just a summary of sort of a bit of an overview of some of our findings here. So under societal barriers, there was obviously a lack of a national policy around inclusive education. There was clear evidence that there were a lot of traditional views about disability in special schools, drawing on the medical model of disability. The drivers were there was some awareness of CRPD and some positive attitudes and beliefs about disability, reflecting an understanding of human rights. With systems, and this was a big area of our data, there was clear policy confusion. So remember, we're looking at Queensland, and Queensland has an inclusive education policy that's well respected and well informed by the CRPD, Article 24 and General Comment number 4, but continues to fund and build and develop new special schools and further develop existing special schools. So we talked about this as policy confusion, and that's drawing on the work of Joanne Banks from Ireland. There was also barriers around disassembling structures and funding supporting segregation. The drivers were around Department of Education policy and guidelines. So there was a lot of, really great positive work there. Also, lots of great government support for family advocacy. For example, there's funding of the Community Resource Unit. So in under school, there was a lack of understanding of inclusive education generally as a barrier and lack of accountability in implementing the policy. So a lot of discussion about school leadership and not having the accountability to support this great policy that was in place. Low expectation of students with disability was also evident. The drivers were around development and support for inclusive ed, increasing teacher skills, allocation of resources, and the new model of resourcing is an example there. Under family barriers, there was parental opposition to closure of special schools, parent views about school choice was evident, and drivers were around parent advocacy for inclusive education. So,
Why would there be parent
Well, we'll come to
opposition?
questions after the presentation.
I'll come back to your question. Happy,
Unfortunate.
yeah, I'm happy to come back to your question. Thanks, Graham.
Thanks, Graham.
So there's a fair bit of detail in the paper. I won't go through all of this detail now, but it will be published. So this gives you a bit more detail about the societal barriers and drivers, and then the systems, barriers and drivers. And you can see there in particular the conflicting messages from Department of Education, policy confusion is written up there. So I'm not going to go through all of those again, and a bit more detail there on that slide about the drivers. Under school as well, a bit more detail that I've got there about the barriers. So still stuck in a lot of deficit models and understandings of disability, lack of understanding of inclusive education, gaps in translating policy to practice, lack of professional learning, accountability, as I said before, school leadership came up. Drivers were around the development, support, and evaluation of inclusive practice. So there's a lot of really great examples of inclusive schools in Queensland, as I'm sure there are in many other places around Australia. And so there was a lot of good examples that we could draw on there. Our family, as I said, parental opposition to the closure of special schools and parent views that school choice is essential. Parent support for special schools was still strongly evident, and parental advocacy for inclusion and closing special schools was also strong as a driver. So just in conclusion here, and these are the conclusions that we come to in our paper, we feel that it's clear that a dual system of mainstream and special schools is hindering the reform that is necessary to create a national inclusive education system. And we suggest that special, meaning segregated schools, in and of themselves remain a significant barrier to true inclusive education reform. We propose that desegregation must occur concurrently with systemic reform supporting inclusion so that all students can be genuinely included. Moving forward, we feel that we need a national policy and plan for inclusive education, because this is going to take time. It's not something that, can happen overnight. That redirects resources to a nationwide inclusive education system for all students. There's a need for professional learning across the education system to support a better understanding of international and national treaties, conventions and policies, and the research evidence to support inclusive education, culture, policy and practice. And there's a really strong need for transformative school leadership for equity and inclusion. So, the focus on having an inclusive school culture and a climate comes up all of the time, and this is one quote here that I've drawn on from the Senate Committee on Education and Employment that says that the culture comes directly from the school principal and other leaders making a priority of inclusive education. So what can you do? I think that we can all model equity and inclusion in our language and in our behaviour. We can all treat others with compassion and dignity. We can have the courage and conviction to challenge inequity, ask tough questions, and point out uncomfortable truths. We need to be brave, intentional, and strategic, and we need to persist over time. So thank you very much for listening. I've got my references at the end of the PowerPoint slides that I think that you will receive, and that's my final slide, just with my contact details if anyone would like to contact me. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you, Graham. You're right. I'll just grab that.
Yep, thanks. Thank you very much, Suzanne. It is really important for us to address uncomfortable truths, isn't it? I mean, this is my uncomfortable truth, which I haven't shared a lot before, but I'll share with all of you tonight. Because I'm one of the students who went to both a special and a segregated and an inclusive school. And I went to the segregated school until year 10, and then I went to the last 2 years at my inclusive school. The segregated school was really well resourced. It had passionate and committed teachers, but it was an hour away from where I lived. So the only friends in my cohort that I have until the age of about 15 or 16 are other kids who couldn't see. That lack has sat with me throughout my life. So thank you, Susan, for flagging the importance of uncomfortable truths. We're now going to move to a panel of presenters, and I'm going to ask the panellists some questions, and then we're going to open the floor both here in the room and on the live stream to questions and discussion. So I'd like to invite Dr. Kate de Bruin back to the panel, and Professor Suzanne Carrington. And I also want to introduce our three panellists. Sarah Asome is the acting principal at Bentley West Primary School in Victoria, and a dyslexia specialist. She has been instrumental in leading the change at BWPS, but also supporting many colleagues state and nationwide in implementing evidence-based literacy instruction in their school. Our second panellist is Sam Brain, who leads Deloitte Access Economics work in inclusive education and has a deep understanding of disability and relevant education policy and practice. Sam has led or contributed to some of our most impactful reports in this area. And our last panellist is G. Brown. G is a proud trans, queer and disabled person who believes in being a keen disruptor to the system. They live and breathe special advocacy and justice for everyone with a specific interest in disability, LGBTIQ youth and mental health through the lens of policy, education and awareness, and their own lived experience. And G is also involved with Children and Youth with Disability Australia, the organisation CYDA. So welcome to all of you. I've got some questions that I want to ask you firstly, but as I said, we will open up to questions from the audience, both here and in the live stream. If you're in the audience, you can ask your questions in two ways. You can either put up your hand the old way, and I have to admit to one of my behavioural faults, which is that if you put up your hand, I'll completely ignore you. But pleasingly, Chantel will notice your hand and she'll come to you with the microphone. Or you can ask your question on using the Slido process, and it will then go into the questions for voting. And if you're on YouTube, you can put your questions into Slido as well. So let me start with you, Sam. How can we develop, do you think, systems that support genuine inclusive education for all learners?
Is this coming through? Thanks very much for the question, Graham, and thanks for having me part of such such an amazing presentation tonight. I think my views on this have been shaped by a few things. First of all, I mean, you mentioned that you were the product of a segregated education system, and I think I am as well. When I had my schooling experience earlier on in life, I certainly wasn't educated alongside many students with disability. wasn't friends with other children with disability, and didn't manage to have that experience throughout my schooling. I think my education was definitely what you'd class as integration, and it was really only later in life when I was working as a bureaucrat within the Commonwealth Department of Education, answering letter after letter after letter from parents who'd been failed in their education system, either failed by mainstream education or a failure to access what they saw as a retreat from that in special education, would write to the Minister for Education asking for some release, and I felt kind of disempowered at being able to help in that respect. So since ceasing my work as a bureaucrat, I've been working with Deloitte on system change and transformation to try and create systems that are as inclusive as possible for as many leaders as possible. And I have a few ideas around things that have helped to shift the dial on that, that have been, I suppose, influenced by my work on some reports, one of which Suzanne's clearly carefully reviewed and commented on tonight. So I think firstly, we need to really understand the culture and what drives segregation, what drives inclusion. I think many of us that work in policy in these matters have been products of segregated education systems, like I previously was, and this just continues to shape attitudes, behaviours, beliefs of people. And these are very hard things that we need to unlearn, but we need to unlearn them, and we need to confront, as you mentioned before, those uncomfortable truths, and we need to stop the limiting attitudes that have been with us in many ways throughout our entire lives. One of the things that Queensland did after the review that we conducted in 2017 was develop an inclusive education statement where they brought views together across the system to understand why inclusion was going to be important to the system and what they were going to do to help create it. I think the second thing I'd say is you need to recognise how organisations make change. One of the key recommendations that we made as part of the review into schooling in Queensland in 2017 was to actually say, as a system, you need to prioritise effort where it's going to actually transform the system. And so, as a result of that, Queensland Queensland decided, I should say, on the selection of a senior bureaucrat who made it her job for the next 4 years to try and institute inclusive traits across the system. And this applies in schools as well. I mean, the notion of strategy and persistence. If you want to make change within a schooling environment, it should happen as part of a school review process and happen as part of a link to a school's 4-year strategic plan. And then finally, measuring. We need to develop means of understanding what inclusion is and where it's occurring. If we accept that we want to promote inclusive education for as many learners as possible, and we accept that that means learners being assessed and being present at school and being present at school with children without disability, then it's just shocking some of the things we don't know across the system. We don't know the level of segregation that takes place across our system. I mean, Kate's done research into that at a national level, but we don't know the breakdown of that at state levels across government and non-government agencies. We definitely don't know where it's occurring in and out of schools. We don't know which students are excluded from assessments of learning progress. We don't know how many students with disability are excluded from mainstream assessments such as NAPLAN, and we don't know how many students lack access to any form of assessment at all. And we don't know how many days of learning at a national or indeed at a state level and being missed by some of our most vulnerable students. And capturing these practices really shouldn't be difficult, and it's something that we need to do. So there's a lot more to it than this. I think systems need to ensure that inclusion's a consideration across all policy areas, but some of these elements that I've mentioned, culture, strategy and data, are some of the superordinate enablers that will actually support policymakers to make change in future.
Thanks very much, Sam. Sarah, let me come to you. Some people argue that a local school such as yours can't really teach and support all students. In your experience, is this possible, or are there some students that you are unable to support?
Thank you, Graham. I argue it is possible, and we do have 100% rate that sit for NAPLAN in our school, despite having 26% of students with difficulties and additional needs. So every single student sits with the right accommodations that they require. And the data for this year alone is that 100% of those students sat NAPLAN, 70% were in those top 2 bands for writing, and no student was below in grade 5 for writing. So that's a point for thought. The reason there was no one below is because they had the right accommodations. So they had the scribes, they had the assistive technology, and that comes from a culture shift from the leadership all the way down to every single member of staff, and having to walk the walk, talk the talk, and have that can-do attitude. So not why can't we do it, what can we do to make this work as a whole staff. And looking at that, it's really important to get, I guess, that what the school change has been is to get tier 1 right. So we had tier 2 and 3 working really well, but we didn't have core instruction. So we had to really shift that instruction and get it right. We knew what worked for students with additional needs was best practice for everybody. So we had to really change that structure and that shape, that culture, and have that team around every individual learner with the student at the centre of their voice, but also the parents. They're the key holders to knowledge for these students with additional needs. And we needed to ensure that they were all upskilled, the staff were upskilled. And it's taken time. It's taken time for us to get there. It's been a long process. It's not overnight. It's taken 8 to 9 years for us to change the whole school and the inclusive practices that are now occurring, because the systems are now in place and they're embedded, and the screening and identification is there from the outset, from before they even walk through the door in foundation. So yes, I argue it can be achieved.
And that leadership, it's really interesting. You talk about that mindset shift, Sarah, and that leadership has to come from the top. That's where any cultural change comes from in any organisation. It's not just learning and education where we get that lesson. G, let me come to you finally. You have interesting experience of segregated and inclusive education in your family, don't you? Can you talk to us about those experiences and the comparisons that you can make?
Yeah, thank you. So I went through most of my schooling in what is known as mainstream school, and I have a younger brother who has only ever been in segregated schooling. There are almost an endless list of differences between the two systems. I think for myself, as a disabled student who'd only ever experienced mainstream schooling, the barriers are there from the get-go, where challenges and difficulties aren't being identified early enough. They're not being identified in the right places, and so supports aren't being put in place early enough. And for me, that set a precedent of struggling through my entire schooling, and in all honesty, struggling that, had I have not gotten support, would have ended my life. Education is not something that's easy when it's designed to oppress you and harm you and make sure that you're not learning. For my brother, the barriers are also there from the start. And as Kate talked about earlier, the assessments that my brother in particular had to go through to get into the segregated school that he attends, we had the people doing the assessments even say things to us like, keep him up all night beforehand so that he gets a worse score to make sure that he gets in. He was recently, or somewhat recently, rejected from a brand new inclusive school that had only started up about around two or 3 years ago. And this, yet again, despite claiming to be inclusive, had a IQ threshold. It took months and months and months to get anyone to agree to redo my brother's IQ testing. He missed the threshold by 1 point, and they refused to let him into the school. That's just getting into into a school in the first place. That is not even the process of education. When I make the comparison between the two systems, my brother is learning things as a 15-year-old that they were teaching him when he was 8. There is no progress in the curriculum. There's this culture of incompetence assumed, that there can't be development, but also that the resources just aren't there. The teachers are in classrooms that need more help, they need more resources, they need more money, but also that when you silo students into one place where their view of the world is limited, where it's constructed for them, there is no room for growth, and it lacks common sense almost that you can expect students to grow when the space just isn't there. There is nothing there to foster that.
Thank you, G. It's so counterintuitive, isn't it? When we do this in the NDIS as well as in the education system, when we set thresholds which push people towards worse performances in order to assess what support people need. If we just assessed for adjustments rather than for disability, you'd have to think that there'd be so much better outcomes overall. I'm going to move, I think, to questions from the floor, which doesn't mean that we won't hear more from our panellists. We certainly will, and we'll also hear from Kate and Suzanne. I'm going to try and direct the questions which haven't already been directed to 1 or 2 of the 5 people that we've got here, because if we have 5 people answering the first question, we won't get through too many more, and we've got 30 minutes now for questions and discussion. But if any of the rest of you are desperate to say something, please speak up, and I'll probably let you. So, Chantal, are we ready to start with our first question, and where's it from, please?
Yeah, well, we had John ask a question before. Did you want to go ask that, John?
Yep.
Or
Yep, we can do that. Okay.
no worries. Well, we've got one question over here.
Hi, guys, and thank you very much for my name's Philip Hayes Brown, and I attended Monash a long time ago. It's great to be here. I'm a pro-inclusion fan as well, and to give personal context, because that's sort of important to know where everyone's coming from. My daughter is 20 and has I guess we've said assessments are all a bit fraught, but anyway, moderate intellectual disability and is non-verbal. Phoebe's gorgeous, and that's why I work now in the disability sector. And so my question / comment a bit is that the work of Kate and Suzanne, etc., is showing that there's lots of evidence and studies to drive all this, but you're sort of frustrated by the resistance and the barriers. I'm one of the barriers, yeah, guys. I guess I should declare and out myself, but I am hopefully part of the same movement. We just disagree on how we get there. So my question sort of is, you just seem to be looking for more and more ways to sort of push through and get to one scheme where everyone receives all the resources that they need in order to flourish, and that's the principle you're aiming at. Does anyone on the panel respect, do people with intellectual disabilities have the rights to self-segregate?
Okay. Kate, would you like to comment on that?
That's a really good question. I'm trying to formulate a response on the fly. They do. So as Suzanne pointed out before, the rights of students are paramount. So parental choice is often put forward as an argument for the placement of a student, but human rights instruments are very clear that the right of the child is the right of a child to an inclusive education is the right of the child and not the parent. I'm unaware of any research that's looked at student preferences for their own placement. I would also query whether a student can make a choice having not experienced both. I mean, I'm unclear as to how that would be done. It would be really interesting research to do, to talk to students who've experienced both. Graham, you experienced both. So looking at people who've graduated from the system perhaps might be a really interesting project to do. I've recently been receiving some communication from parents whose students have just graduated, and they are particularly disappointed with the life presented for their children afterwards. And some of them are expressing frustration that the schooling their children received didn't provide anything later, and they regretting their choices. But those are the voices of the parents. So I'm just being clear that I haven't received the voices of the children. There was a really interesting report written by the Caston Institute a couple of years ago that was representing the voices of recently graduated students. So it didn't talk about their right, but it did talk about their experience as frustration. They couldn't access the education they wanted. And I think that perhaps might be where I'll leave my point, is that I don't think we are giving students the support they need. G's talked very passionately about the disappointing experience that they had to access the supports, and also that your brother has. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to provide students with what they need.
It's an interesting question. Thanks very much, Kate. I'll just come to you briefly, Suzanne, after I say this, but it's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, all of us in the community can self-segregate. It's not so much that we need a right. We can all choose to do that. We can all choose to participate in communities of like people in some way or another. But I'm working with an organisation now that's addressing the question of home and living, and the question of what's the next model after group homes, because group homes, as a general comment, are negative experiences for many of the people that live in them. And it's fascinating because, of course, the first thing you do when you're running a project like that is that you talk to the people who are living in the group homes and you get their views. You know, you can't do co-design without that. And it's not just one conversation, but you have to have many conversations, because many people have spent most of their lives in that setting and don't know much different. It's fascinating to see how the conversations change when the choices start to be laid out, and when the opportunities for a different way of living start to become clearer. And we haven't reached any conclusions in that project yet, so I'm just sharing the experience so far. But thank you for the question. Suzanne, did you want to make any comments?
Yeah, sure. And it's a really, good point and a good question. I guess I would sort of think about, that word choice. And I don't know whether people have seen the lovely slide that many of us use, drawing on Robert Jackson's work, who I think actually drew on someone else's work. It's one of those bodies of work that you're never actually sure where it came from. But there's a lovely slide that talks about, the choices, you know, that we make or people may have. And if we think about a young child who's born who has a disability, who begins life, you know, encouraged to go to a special early intervention unit, who before they realise it, they're going to a special school, special primary school, then move on to a special secondary school, and then may end up being involved in, you know, very sort of limited choices, perhaps for employment. The sort of conversation about that is a child who has that type of track has a more narrow life and less choice about, you know, what they may be able to be participating in. Whereas if we think about another child, for example, who is encouraged to go to their local kindergarten, you know, goes to prep and is well supported, this is the issue, has a good inclusive experience in an inclusive primary school, goes on to an inclusive secondary school, has more opportunities and will have a greater chance. All of the research tells us they have a better chance of living more independently, possibly, you know, with support, have better chance of being engaged in meaningful employment and more broader social experiences, and have a bigger life. So that's how I would respond to your question.
Thanks.
Doesn't really give you an answer, but it's a way that I would respond.
Thanks, Suzanne. It's interesting, isn't it? You know, as I was growing up as a kid at school, I used to think lonely weekends were the norm. And then I realised that there was an alternative. It's fascinating. Thanks for that question, Philip. Chantal, have we got an online question?
Yes, we do, and it has been going up and down with the questions. So at the moment, the top question is, where do independent schools sit in terms of both accountability and funding to move towards inclusive education and away from exclusion, segregation and integration?
Sam, are you in a position to start us off on that?
I can start us off, Graham, and then we might see where else it goes. So, I mean, independent schools are in an interesting place. By virtue of the framework that they operate under, they can exclude students under different criteria that government schools are unable to exclude them under. Their students with disability are protected under the Disability Discrimination Act, but that doesn't stop independent schools excluding students on the basis of wealth or capacity to contribute, or even prior assessment scores, which we know can inadvertently act to exclude students with disability in some circumstances. So I think that the question is a really interesting one, because they're such an important part of the Australian education system, and they influence the level of socioeconomic segregation that actually exists within the public system as well, which is just another force that acts within a lot of schools that means there is less resources to focus on and allow schools to really act to include students with disability in government systems too. So there's a real sort of system-wide effect. But we also need to acknowledge that because of the advances in the Commonwealth funding model recently, independent schools are able to access adjustments-based funding almost directly from the Commonwealth government too, and are in quite a good position to be able to receive those resources, and so in many cases may be able to be leaders in this space.
Okay. Do any other panel members want to comment, or should we move on to the next question? I do want to get through as many as I can. No, I'm taking that as a no.
Yep, let's move on.
Yep. Okay, thanks. Chantal, another question from the room, please.
Yep, we've got one from John.
Yep.
So I'm just coming over, John.
Chantal is doing everything tonight. She's up, there on the computers, running the microphones. What a legend. And we've got Henry, the wizard internet operator, in the back here that you don't see, but he's being very effective as well. John.
Good, thank you, Graham. I've stood up so you can see me. I'm the grey-headed one up the front. I was the first executive officer at the Krongol Centre here and worked within the education faculty. and reached out to all government school systems and private and Catholic school systems. And now, many years later, having studied overseas, I have committed my life as principal of a specialist school in Dandenong, the largest provider of applied learning, VCAL studies in the area of disability in the state. Have an extraordinary placement into employment and into apprenticeships. And so I find tonight's conversation to be quite curious. So to my question.
Yes.
When one talks about parental opposition to the closure of specialist schools, I was the one that introduced the word specialist school in 1992. And I particularly refer, Kate, the Collins report of 1984 in Victoria, which really was a watershed report that changed the whole system in the state, which, while it wasn't a national system, it was an extraordinary effect it had. So the question is, you know, how the rights of a parent, the feeling of a parent of a 7-year-old who is really looking to be totally included and not marginalised in a school should be subordinate or subservient to the rights of a child. With my 56 years of education behind me in serving the people of Victoria, I find that to be a curious circumstance to have. And after my name in my letters is Emerson School, Emerson, inclusion at its finest. Okay. Because the people that are totally included, with me working with 235 primary and secondary schools throughout the region, and having dedicated my life to that area, I can understand why parents choose. So I find it to be offensive.
Okay, well, let's get to the answer, John. Thank you for that question.
Let me finish the question, please, Graham.
Well, I thought you had.
No, I hadn't, Graham.
Please finish it.
Okay, radio. That I would say that a parental opposition is not a barrier. It should be viewed in not that negative term. And that I think that 9.2% of people in Australia choose to go to a specialist school because of what the options are available or the tyranny of distance. In Victoria, it's 46%.
John, I'm sorry, I'm hearing statement.
So the question is, okay, thank you, Graham. You cut me off before, but I'll finish now. So the question is, shouldn't parents have a choice? And could you find it in your heart to show that the options and choice provide wonderful opportunities for students to get a scholarship, so to speak, just like any other select entry school?
Okay. Thanks, John.
Who would answer that question?
Well, we'll see how we go with the panel answering that question.
Thanks, Graham.
Kate or Suzanne, would you like to start?
Just trying to dig through that. So I think one comment that I just picked up on you was about why is it a barrier? Why do we see it as a barrier that parents have a choice to choose a special school? I think. Yeah. So first of all, that framework, societal, systemic, school, family, that framework was developed to consider what are the drivers and the barriers to desegregation. So that was the focus of our work. And so we found through the data that we gathered through that project that parents who think that that is their choice to choose a special school is actually continuing to be a barrier to desegregating. Okay, so that was the focus of our work there. I guess, and I've just done a keynote address for the National Paediatricians Conference in Sydney, where we were talking about trying to encourage paediatricians to have a good understanding of inclusive education, and so that they give parents who have a child who has a disability information about inclusive education, and they're aware that it is their right to go to their local school with their siblings. So we just find that some parents, before they realise it, they're going down the special education track. You know, that's that Robert Jackson sort of pathway with, you know, not being able to get off that special education track. Whereas if they knew that they had, it was their right and their child's right to be able to access an inclusive education at their local school with their siblings, with their friends in their local community, in such a way that, you know, Graham's talked about, you know, would have been an amazing experience for him, then that gives them an opportunity that they may not have realised that they had. So the issue comes back again to this idea of choice that I think Philip, we sort of talked about as well. Sometimes you don't realise that there are choices because you're pushed down a certain track. Whereas we're in a situation now, Australia, as in 182 countries around the world, are signatory to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, and we have signed up, not just in Australia but internationally, to progress an inclusive approach to education, and that's, you know, where our focus is.
No, John, I'm sorry. I'm going to take questions from other people in a moment, but you have had a chance to ask your question. Kate, did you want to comment?
I'd love to add to Suzanne's
Sure.
answer. I'll try and be brief because I know you asked us to be brief and I tend to be a talker. So I've got two answers. The first is that education is the right of the child. It's not the right of the parent. So all of the human rights instruments that surround the provision of that right and whose responsibility it is to uphold that right focus on that.
John,
Just
please.
let me finish my answer if you would, thanks. So that's why the focus is on the right of the child to the education. This means there are human rights instruments that provide for parental choice. And that's very clearly outlined in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Civil Rights. Always takes me a minute to get that title right. And the committee who oversee that International Covenant regularly make general comments, like the committees who outline the provisions and guidance for all of the other treaties. And they've been very clear what state parties like Australia who sign these treaties are obliged to do to uphold parental rights to choice. And parental rights to choice are around values, and that largely responds to religion and culture. So that means there's an obligation on state party signatories not to remove the right and choice of parents to have an education for their child consistent with that. So if we think about a country like, it means that a Palestinian child living in Israel can't be forced, if you like, to go to the yeshiva. The government must provide some kind of state-sponsored option consistent with the values and culture of parents. But the Committee on the International Covenant has been very clear that governments are not required or obliged to uphold a right of a parent to choose a segregated setting within the set of rights overseen by that instrument. And they have specified that state parties offering a segregated choice is inconsistent with their own covenant. I hope I was brief enough.
No, that's great. Thank you, Kate. And you've said what I was about to say, so I'll move on to the next question. Thank you for your question, John. Chantal, Chantal, I keep calling you the wrong name. What have we got online, please?
We've actually got one that's come through from social media, Graham,
Great.
so I'll put that through. It's a bit of a long one, so bear with me. My question is about the notion of specialism and specialist and faith schools in the context of inclusion. Many school systems around the world have specialist schools where the specialism is academic or artistic. So magnet schools in the US might specialise in science or maths. Specialist schools in the UK might specialise in performing arts or sport. Several school systems, state-funded, offer faith schools, Islamic, Jewish schools, etc. So the question is, are specialist schools like these and faith schools incompatible with the ideals of inclusion you have argued for?
Who'd like to comment on that from the panel? I mean, I might make a comment to start with. different conventions, different human rights conventions set out different rights in different areas. And Kate was referring to the International Covenant on
Economic, social and civil.
no, economic, social and cultural rights. Cultural rights. But there's another document which is the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and the expert committee on that document has said the same thing as the document on the covenant that Kate set out in terms of education of kids with disabilities. So in that sense, we're talking across different rights when we try to compare social and cultural rights, rights of people, including children with disabilities, and opportunities to specialise in a particular area or subject. That's how I would respond to the question, but I don't know whether any of the other panel members would like to add anything to that.
I think you've done a beautiful job.
Oh, okay. Well, let's go back to the room then. Do we have another question from the room, Chantal?
Yes, we do. We've got from one lady here.
Excellent.
Hi, my name is Kimberly. I would like to, I guess, ask, well, first off, we talked about teacher education being one of the barriers, and we talked about at your school it's taken many years to get that Tier 1 instruction correct. Where does this responsibility lie? Are universities changing their undergraduate courses to implement that really clear Tier 1 instruction to students? And, you know, or is it put on the shoulders of principals to really make sure that they're hiring staff that are having the same values and really upskilling their staff members? That's my question.
Good question, thank you. Sarah, would you like to start us on that, and then maybe Kate or Suzanne might want to comment?
Yeah, I'm happy to start from school perspective. Certainly we are having to upskill staff when they come to our school, be it a graduate or an experienced teacher who doesn't have that inclusive knowledge of Tier 1 instruction, Tier 2 or Tier 3 instruction, whether that's behaviour, learning, academic wellbeing. So yes, we're having to put extensive training there, and it would be lovely if they came from university with that knowledge, whichever university that might be. But yeah, that would be fabulous. But we have seen a bit of a shift too. Certainly in Victoria there has been a shift, and again this week the phonics screening check was announced finally for Victoria, so there is a bit of a shift there happening.
Kate, Suzanne, did you want to add anything to that? Thanks, Sarah.
Add to that, because I have been in teacher education for a long time now. When I moved from being in schools to the university sector, I moved in 1993, and I was employed in New South Wales to write some of the first units on, it was actually called integration then, it wasn't even called inclusion. And so I think New South Wales was one of the first states who made it compulsory for teachers doing their preparation to do a unit on integration, which became inclusion. But one of the points that I would make is, so that's been around for a long time. The problem is that there's still a big problem with not really understanding what inclusive education is. So there's many of Kate's and my colleagues who are still teaching a special education program, a special education course. And I started my talk by saying I was trained as a special education, but special education, inclusive education are different. They come from different paradigms. Special education is formed by a deficit model of disability. Inclusive education is formed by a social model of disability. So they're like chalk and cheese. So we have a lot of work to do across our universities in preparing our university educators to have a good understanding of what inclusive education is, which is part of our challenge. Not only people in the universities, but across our states and territories all over Australia. Our next body of work that my team and I are looking at is we are doing a review of the policy, strategic plans and guidelines across every state and territory in Australia. And I've just downloaded them all and I can already see they're hugely different with a lot of not consistent language and understanding about what inclusive education is.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks for that question, Hilary. Let's go to online, Chantel.
Sure, Graham. We've got one that is, what metrics should we use to determine how inclusive a school is?
Gee, would you like to make a comment about that? How do we determine how inclusive a school is?
I think there are many ways to do it, and it depends on how you want to look at it. I think one of the problems with academia and I guess the use of metrics is that it only gets one set of data from one angle about one type of thing. You cannot humanize people through statistics. You cannot humanize students through metrics. It just is impossible. I think it's important that multiple types of evidence and evidence gathering are used to get a holistic picture of what a school environment is like, both from, I suppose, from a governance perspective, from a teaching perspective, from teaching outcomes, but also that you enter these education institutions and you're asking the students and you're hearing directly from their mouths what their experience is. Education outcomes mean nothing without the well-being of its students and without the inclusion of its students. I don't recall ever being asked by anyone what my school experience was like. And if you, well, in a recent study published by CIDA, with some researchers that I was a part of, it looked at the post-school transition for students that have graduated around 2020. And you will find that the results say that a lot of students, well, no, none of us were asked what our school environment was like or how it was for us. And for a lot of us, that was the first time we'd ever been given a chance or a platform to say, well, actually, it was bad. And unfortunately, a lot of the outcomes are the same. Incredibly high rates of mental illness, falling through the cracks post-school, where we don't know what there is in terms of employment, further education, social lives, having our own families, and so on. So I wouldn't use the word metrics because metrics implies that you're gathering statistical data, which, yes, is an important aspect. But we're real kids in real schools. You're playing with our futures, with our lives. We're not a set of statistics. And unfortunately, the reality is that a lot of us lose our lives literally because we can't handle it, or that we go on to live an unfulfilled life because we're ruled by a statistic.
Thank you, G, for a really powerful answer to that question. But I can't pass the opportunity when we've got a man from Deloitte's on the panel to let him get away with not commenting on a question about metrics. Sam, would you like to add anything?
Thanks, Graham. I mean, I think my answer would mirror G's in so many ways. I mean, you can't the question what metrics should be used to gauge how inclusive a school is. It really depends on what we're trying to ascertain from that question. If we're looking at an individual school and trying to understand what it is about that school that makes it inclusive, or what it is about that school that makes it not inclusive, no metric is going to tell us. No metric is going to tell us that. No metric is going to be able to really unpack like what is driving the statistics that we see coming from the school, the outcomes that we see within that school. Where I think metrics have the power to change behaviours, to change mindsets, to actually make our system is when we look at them at a whole of system level. When we look at groups of schools at a state level or across administrative regions within states or within sectors, and we ask, okay, what proportion of students within that system are accessing segregated education for whatever reason? What proportion of students with disability within a system are not able to access assessments that enable them to gauge their learning? What proportion of students with disability are not able to attend attend school every single day. Those sorts of metrics can really get at the heart of what it means for a system to be inclusive, which is really the aggregate of all schools being inclusive, and that's where those metrics have the power to shape and enhance the system's progress towards inclusion.
Thank you, Sam. Now, Chantal, the hardest question of the night. Can I squeeze in one more question before I have to wrap up?
A really quick one.
A quick one from the room. Have we got one from the room?
We've got one here.
A quick question, a quick answer to wrap us up.
Thank you. So we spoke about how a dual system is a barrier to inclusive education, yet it's clear that inclusive education is quite far from our current system, meaning that incremental change is needed to make mainstream schools inclusive for students who are currently in specialist schools, especially those who have been burned by mainstream settings. So how do we go about this, considering that these two things seem to be in opposition of each other?
Kate, Suzanne, would you like to start us off, or maybe Sarah?
It certainly can occur, and I believe that, but I can also see the devastating effects and how quickly things can derail. I've had my own daughter who has pretty much left school and then we've re-engaged her, but at a secondary setting, and how quickly that can derail without the right supports. But I think it comes back to that education again. It comes back to teacher education. It's not necessarily the resources. It doesn't come down to the funds as such. Yes, they help, but certainly without the new disability inclusion money that's coming along the way, we were doing it already at our school. Certainly that's been a bonus with the new funding model, and I think it's a fantastic step forward for Victoria. But it can happen without the funds. It's about the whole school culture and the teacher training and the skills, because no teacher goes into school and says they're going to do a bad job. Everybody wants what's best for the kids sitting in front of them, but they need to be empowered with that knowledge and skills in every course.
Thanks, Sarah. Kate or Suzanne, did you want to quickly comment? Or no? Yes?
I'll have a go.
Yep.
Yeah. I think of it like an onion. It's like you can't pull, or maybe a set of levers. You can't pull one and get change. You can't change teacher education and fix all of this. The curriculum, the policy, the teacher education, the principal education, our disability funding models, our overarching legislation, the adversarial nature of our legal system. I don't think we can pull any one of those levers and fix this. I think we could pull a few and get a lot of traction. But I also think that if we sit around waiting until everybody's ready and until every single one of those is better, we'll be waiting forever. And, you know, Suzanne talked about some of the lessons learnt from systems overseas. How did they accomplish this? And I sat in the room in New Brunswick in Canada and listened to people who'd been involved in the planned closure of special schools there. And that's what's needed, the plan. We all need to work together on this. This isn't, you know, a war between people. This is about kids' lives in real schools every day. And I actually think that we all share that vision, regardless of all the things, Philip, you talked about all the things that we agree about. And I think this would be the one, that we all want the best outcomes for the most vulnerable kids in the system, and schools to be places that don't harm them, that educate them, that set them up to have friends for life, meaningful lives after school. We all want those things. So I think it's about bringing alignment across all of those within a time frame. I think we set a time frame. And I think it's, you know, SIDE has put out a roadmap, and I think it's time we start talking about delivering on that roadmap.
Well, that's a really appropriate way to end this conversation tonight. You know, Kate started this conversation tonight with the idea of having a conversation about where we've come from, that roadmap of history, and how we can keep going to the goal of all children being educated together and children with disabilities being included. And the Dean of the school here at Monash University supported that initiative. And it's been an excellent and powerful conversation, I think, for one reason and one reason alone. And that is because of the voices that have been included. We've included the voices of academics and researchers. We've included the voices of practitioners, either practitioners before or practitioners now. But most importantly, and the only way we'll get to that place of everyone having the safest and most included education is that in having G here with us today and in my involvement, we've included the voice of people with disabilities. And that I see that in the NDIS, where for too long that hasn't been done and the scheme is in trouble. And I see it in terms of employment, where people with disabilities are not well listened to, and we're employed at a rate 30% lower than the general population. And I see it in education. And maybe the key to unlock this process is to continue, as we have tonight, to include the voice of people with disabilities. Kate, thank you for initiating this idea, and to you and Suzanne, thank you for your participation tonight and your presentations. Sarah, Sam and G, it's been fantastic to have you on the panel and hear your perspectives. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, watching online or enjoying the recording. On your screen you will see a slide about some fascinating upcoming events that are taking place at Monash in the near future, and I couldn't, as an MC working here at Monash, go away without mentioning those events because they'll take they'll provide some excellent educative involvement.